Hello. This is a free thought forum by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. Today, March 5, 2013, and I'm Joe Barnhart. Welcome.
And I am Dr. David Howell, and we want you to know that if you don't believe in God, you are not alone. Right here in East Tennessee, you can find free-thinking atheists and agnostics. This is a show for them and people curious about living a life free of supernatural beliefs.
It's a call-in show. I want you to call in, if you will. And we have only one phone line, so if you can't get through, use tweet, if you can, to comment at FFTV Knox. And the show is a production of the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee and their supporters and guests.
Today our topic is the origin of Islam.
And our guest today is Dr. David Howell, who has a PhD from Stanford University, which is no insignificant university in our country. And we are very grateful to have him. He teaches at Pellissippi College. And so let's hear about our sponsors a little bit too. On the next page.
Yeah, you want to mention the Atheist Society there, Joe?
Yeah, let's go ahead and mention them if you would. And
if you want to do that, and then I'll mention the Rationalists of East Tennessee.
Yeah, okay. It's a fun group. The Atheist Society of Knoxville is a fun group, and they meet at restaurants. And today's meetup is at Barley's downtown here, and it's a happy hour for food and drink and conversation. So look for the Silver Jacket. They have a book out now, The God Delusion, which is standing upright on the table.
That's by Richard Dawkins, right?
Richard Dawkins, yes.
Yes. The Rationalists of East Tennessee have monthly activities on the first and third Sunday mornings. They are usually lectures with a lively roundtable discussion. The fourth Sunday is the Reflections Gathering, which is a potluck afternoon gathering at a member's home with a discussion topic. Last March, we traveled to Washington for the Redesign rally, and this next weekend, several of us are planning a road trip to see Richard Dawkins in Charleston, South Carolina.
And that ought to be a very interesting trip. Well, let's move into today's topic, a very interesting topic. We hear about Islam on the news, and unfortunately the news is not very accurate sometimes about Islam or about any other religion sometimes, because news reporters obviously don't study much about religion most of the time.
I think they're better than they used to be, though.
The
media have taken seriously that they need to know more about religion, and I've noticed a change in the last 20 years.
It's interesting. Even the political science departments realize you can't do political science now without studying religion.
That's right.
It's just impossible because it's part of a culture.
Yes.
So let's see what we can learn about Islam. What does Islam, how does it view other religions, especially Judaism and Christianity?
Yeah, that's a good question, Joe. And the answer, of course, is going to be that depends upon the Muslim. If you think about it in terms of Christianity, which I'm sure you are familiar with, some Christians believe that only their particular group is on the proper relationship with God, and other kinds of Christians believe that almost everybody who lives a good life will be rewarded properly when the time comes. And the same thing is true of Muslims. But the historical tradition is that particularly the people of the book, which is the people of the Tanakh, which we call the Old Testament, and the New Testament, are both peoples who were originally addressed by their prophets on what it is that the one God wants of them. And so traditionally, Muslims have a positive attitude toward those they call the people of the book, the Jews and Christians, as long as they believe that the Jews and Christians are living as their respective prophets have told them that they should. Beyond that, there's a passage in the Quran which says that God has sent prophets to all the nations. This is the one God who is concerned about the well-being of all human beings any place, and therefore the belief is that God has told everyone, although in different forms appropriate to the situation they're in, about himself and what they're supposed to do. But this all culminates in Muhammad, who is for a Muslim the seal of the prophets, the last prophet, who corrects mistakes that have gradually crept in for the other people of the book and for other peoples. And eventually Muslims believe that all the world will become Islam, that is, all the world will accept their submission to the one God.
Yeah, that was pretty much a Christian view in the 19th century. The post-millennial Christianity had a somewhat similar view of widespread Christianity. Well, what's Islam's Islamic understanding of, say, Jesus?
That he is the second most important prophet after Muhammad. Prophets begin with Adam and continue through all the traditional prophets of the Old Testament and include Jesus. So Muslims are very careful to say that the one important mistake, and it's really the only really important mistake that Christians have made, is in believing that Jesus is divine. For they believe that no human being can possibly divine. That would make God not just one, but more than one. And the great enemy for Muslims, historically and traditionally, are the polytheists, those who believe in many gods. And so I think there is a real possibility that errors will creep in if you believe that any human being could be divine. But he is believed to be a prophet, which means very specifically someone who is sent by God to speak for God to human beings for the well-being of all human beings. And in addition, Muslims believe that at the end of time, they share with Jews and Christians the idea that time is linear. And at the end of time, God will finally gather all unto himself, and all of life's history will come to an end. At that point, it will be Jesus who will be the one who will lead the forces of God to have all people then become Muslims. You can understand how Christians think that that's rather an odd view, that Jesus will say that he, at the end of time, all people should become Muslims. But remember, by Muslim, we mean essentially all those who submit their lives absolutely to God.
Okay, what about atheists? What happens to them on the Islamic framework?
Yeah, an atheist is not a polytheist and doesn't believe in many gods, so he really is not in as bad a shape as a polytheist is. But an atheist is someone who denies the absolute sovereignty of God by denying the existence of God himself. There's a curious comparison, which I actually just thought of at the moment, that Billy Graham says that the problem with an atheist is that they want to run their own lives rather than putting their lives in God's hands. And with that, a Muslim would absolutely agree. The problem with an atheist is they want to run their own lives.
That would be their view.
That's right, rather than putting their lives in God's hands. Of course, Muslims have a different idea about exactly how one goes about putting their lives in God's hands than Christians do, but the general idea is the same.
Yeah, putting your life in God's hands usually means you have human beings interpreting what God's hands are. So from an atheist point of view, you still got the same problem of human beings doing the interpreting of all of this.
Right, and a Muslim will say, with regard to this, that among the people of the book, the whole Abrahamic tradition, and by the Abrahamic tradition, I mean all those people who believe that Genesis is essentially correct. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and that he came to Abraham and made a covenant with Abraham, and that this covenant was then to rejoin people with the God who made them for their best interest and best outcome. So Muslims are in this Abrahamic tradition, but what they will say here is that the Jews and the Christians have gone somewhat off track. And the way they've gone off track is exactly in the way in which you mentioned, that since from a Muslim point of view, the Tanakh and the New Testament are what people say that God said. The Quran for a Muslim is not people saying what God said, but is God himself speaking first person. If you read the Quran, it says, we tell you such and such. The we there, by the way, it took me a while to understand this. The we is the royal we. When the king speaks, the king says we. He doesn't say
LBJ
I.
used to do that.
That's right, that's right. Anybody who claims absolute authority says we. So in the Quran, the Muslim understands that God is saying to us exactly what we need to know directly. Muhammad becomes the prophet, the mouthpiece through whom he speaks, and who is changed in the process that's happening, of course.
Okay, now.
Yes, anyway, so the point of the bottom line of this is that if the Quran really is, as the Muslims say it is, God's direct speech, much less interpretation is needed. So they think that they are in a superior position to Christians and Muslims because they need a lack of interpretation, and Christians and Jews do need interpretation.
So they only got two branches then, major branches, Shia and Sunni?
The Sunni and the Shiite are the two traditional branches, and they came into existence at Muhammad's death when the question arose, as it does in all religions, by the way. The question arose, who's going to be in charge now? One person said it's Ali, who was his son-in-law and also his cousin. Another party said no, there are different people who are supposed to be in charge now. So it's an historical split. There are some differences in doctrine as well, but both of them accept the authority of the Quran. Both of them. I think we have a speaker here, so I would just shut up so we can listen. Hi, you're on the air. What would you like to ask?
Well, hello. This is Faithless Forrest. I've been watching the show and have kind of a question that I was hoping you could maybe help with. I read a little bit about the origin of Islam, that Muhammad lived around some the 600 AD time frame.
Yep, born in 570, starts receiving the Quran in 620. Yep.
I think I heard 620 there, okay.
Yep.
And what I know about the origin of Islam actually comes from time-life history theory. And they told me something interesting, and that was that initially Muhammad had his followers face Jerusalem and pray. And I was wondering if you could confirm that.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then what might have prompted the change to where they would face Mecca? I think that might be interesting to learn about.
Yeah, my understanding is that a Muslim would say the change came about because God told him that the change was to come about, and that he was supposed to, well, Muslims were supposed to face Mecca rather than Jerusalem. Jerusalem remains the second holiest city in the world after Mecca, but Mecca becomes the first, and therefore it's the place to address when one prays. There's also an historical reason. I'm not sure how happy a Muslim will be with what I have to say next, but the historical reason is when the armies of Mecca attacked Medina, where Muhammad had gone as mayor in order to be able to coalesce the first group of Muslims. Medina was inhabited by 5 tribes. 2 of them were Jewish, and 3 of them were the Arabs, who were the first Muslim followers. Things went well for quite a while, but when the attack was made, the understanding that I have gotten is that Muhammad and his Arab followers believed that the Jews left the fighting up to the Arabs and did not take their fair share of it. And when that happened, the direction of Islam, in which it now becomes more separate from its parent religion of Judaism, and the relationship with Jews changes at that point. Let me repeat. A lot of Muslims would not be happy with that historical interpretation that I've given, because they would say that it's because this is simply what God told Muhammad, and therefore what they should do. But it sounds plausible to me.
Very interesting book on the development of who Muhammad was, and this tradition is, the title of it is The Quest for the Historical Muhammad, written by a man who had grown up in the Muslim tradition. And very much like trying to show how the the Mosaic tradition has many streams going into it. It's very complex, much more complex than we.
All right, well, I have another question regarding the evolution of early Islam.
Yes, go ahead.
And once again, from the Time Life book, they talk about the pilgrimage, I think it's called the Hajj, where you're supposed to go and walk around the Kaaba.
Right.
That making the pilgrimage to the Kaaba was actually kind of like a pre-Islamic ritual, and that when Muhammad, I guess, conquered Mecca, that as part of maybe, let's say, the surrender terms, the city fathers asked, well, you supposed to incorporate, a pilgrimage to our city in your religion, so to sustain our tourism. Do you follow my question?
Yes. Well, what's your question exactly? You're certainly right about the history there.
Of Kaaba.
Yeah.
Oh, the Kaaba, yes, the Kaaba would hold
tradition about which I know little or nothing.
Okay. In order to not make this too long, the short answer is that the Kaaba and Mecca as a whole was a pilgrimage for lots and lots of different tribes with different religious traditions and different gods in Saudi Arabia before Muhammad came on the scene. One thing that often happens in religion is that the new religion will attempt to co-opt some of the rituals and practices and places of the older religions. The polytheists, as I said before, are the real enemies here in early Islam. And so now Mecca and the Kaaba become the place for just Muslims to come rather than a place that all the different polytheistic religions can come.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, one last little amplification. What might be the names of those prior? Would they be some of the ones, the Christian and
No, these were a variety of tribal gods of the different tribal groups in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Would I recognize any of their names?
I certainly don't know what they are, and so you may or may not, but I don't know of any.
Okay. Thank you for calling.
Let me clear the line, and I hope you get some more callers on the origins of Islam.
Thank you. That was a very polite set of questions.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Well, we often hear about violence in Islam. In Knoxville here, when there was some violence, a group of Muslims came to the hospital and brought meals to those who had suffered violence. This seemed to me an act of peace and neighborliness, not an act of violence. And so talk to us. In the news you hear a lot about violence in Islam, but give us a broader picture.
Yeah. There's some obvious things that can be said, which is that all religions are expressed by the people that end up practicing that religion as they understand the religion.
Good point.
And every religion has got violent strains and peaceful strains. And so Islam is no exception to that. Again, one can speak traditionally and Quranically. And Quranically the Quran says that one should never use violence against non-combatants and never use violence unless Islam itself has been attacked. But it does distinguish itself from the official theology of Christianity, which, if that comes from Jesus, as it surely does, says to turn the other cheek. How often? 7 times? No, 7 times, 70 times. And so it is very much more similar, as it is in lots of ways. A student of mine pointed this out to me one time, that Islam and Judaism really are much more alike each other than either one is to Christianity. And one of the ways in which they are alike is that Judaism and Islam both insist that in order to defend their covenantal task given to them by God to promote God's will, violence may be necessary sometimes. And so all the stories in the Old Testament about the battles that were fought by the Jews is the beginning of and part of that Jewish understanding.
One of the interesting things and the sad things is you can fight if you're under attack. Now, the word attack can be interpreted in so many ways. Like
yes, it certainly
if you
can.
disagree with me, that's an attack, you see. Now, obviously, you're attacking my ideas, not me.
Yep.
So how do I defend? Well, I presumably come back with another argument, or if you happen to be right, I have to say, well, I think you make a good point.
That's right. That's right. And this is as true in the religious world, after all, when it gets expressed in actual cultural practices, as it is in the secular world. And everyone always wants to say, no, we never started it. We were simply responding to what the bad guys did.
Yeah,
everyone always wants to insist that's what's going on.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's true, and sometimes it's not true.
Yeah, we do tend to use the word attack sometimes very loosely.
Yes.
And in that sense,
and feel like we're threatened too.
Yeah, well, in England they had blasphemy laws, which could be interpreted. You differ with certain interpretations of their religion. As a matter of fact, in the Church of England in the 17th century prohibited Baptists from coming into England because it was thought they would pollute the morals of the people.
Yes.
And so they would use. And they hanged Baptists, of all people, in New England.
That's right. There's long stories there.
So you've got all kinds of religions practicing both peace and vicious, sadistic attacks on each other.
Yeah, I just as soon leave the vicious and sadistic part out of it. But you're certainly right.
Well, when you're shot or you're killed, your relatives think it's pretty vicious.
I guess I want to say two more things. One, the earliest traditions of Islam are when Muhammad goes to Mecca. That's when they begin their calendar, by the way. It's not when the Quran is first given, nor is it when they return to Mecca. For them, this new age has begun when he leaves Mecca and goes to Medina with a group of faithful followers to begin practicing this new kind of following God's will. And when they went there, the Meccans surely did follow him there and attempt to put down what they saw as a threat to their economic well-being.
Well,
the origins of being in a defensive position, originally they were in a defensive position, but then of course things change over time and what counts. The other thing I'd like to say here is that the more comfortable and educated and secure a person feels, the more I think they're able to say, no, I'm not being attacked yet, and we can figure out a way to live together.
I can give you a good example. I had a graduate student, a woman from Pakistan who was Muslim, very bright, PhD student. And I realized this is a woman I can learn a lot from. So I said, would you mind walking around campus with me about once a week and let me be educated?
Yeah.
And she did. And then I realized, now, this was a type of class in which she could have an hour or two in class to talk to my students. And she presented, I thought, a beautiful presentation. What was funny is that she was from I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Sunni background, and I had some from Iran, and they disagreed with her.
Right. The heart of Shiite is in Iran and Iraq and that particular part of the Middle East.
That made it interesting. I said, well, it reminds me of simply Baptists and Methodists who will have differences among themselves. On Kingston Pike, you can find Baptists who are greatly different from each other.
Right. And then when you get to Catholics and Protestants, and the difference becomes greater. As far as the Orthodox in Christianity are concerned, except for the fact that they give a nice banquet once a year down at their church, most people I've discovered in East Tennessee don't know much about Orthodox Christianity at all. The caller called when you were asking me about the Shiites and the Sunnis. And the differences there, as I said, are primarily an historical difference. But this is an historical difference that
it's a cultural thing, too.
Yeah, that had lots of consequences down through the ages and battles that never got settled. I really do think that the bigger difference within Islam is not between Shiites and Sunnis, but between both of them and the Sufis. And the Sufis are the more mystical branch of Islam, and have been under attack by both Sunnis and Shiites throughout their history.
Okay, I have another question. How many Muslims are there in the world?
About 1.5 billion. How many, Joe, do you think live in the Middle East and are Arabs?
Probably not. That's a small part of the world.
It
Very
certainly
small part
is.
of the world.
What country would you say, and the answer is about 25% of Muslims are Arabs. The vast majority are not. What country in the world do you think has the most Muslims?
Well, I don't know. India might have a lot.
Well, Pakistan more than India, but no. The country with the most Muslims is Indonesia.
Well, yeah, that makes sense.
Which is a very heavily populated country. And I asked an Indonesian one time about the Sunni-Shiite split, and they said, we don't care much about that out here in Indonesia. That's really an Arab conflict. And so too in the United States.
That's what a Muslim said in town here to me. He said, well, that's a political difference. That's not a religious difference. I mean, she just blew it off as not a really basic religious difference.
Yes, and that's why I brought up the difference between both of them and Sufi, because there really is a difference. And Sufis are much more likely to say, we have no quarrel with any other religions in the world as long as they practice it in a wholehearted way.
Okay, now let me get another question. Why are some Muslims considered to be so violent as against some others? This is partly what we're talking about, against those who are considered to be mainstream of the Quran. Now, recently we heard this story of some Sunnis who killed the Shia in, where was it, Pakistan or what country? I forgot.
Yeah, it was either in Pakistan or Iran or Iraq, that center of that where that battle goes on.
So why is that?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons, but I think that they are more cultural and political, as you just said,
makes sense.
Than they are religious.
And as you pointed out, all groups have violent people in them.
They do indeed.
I mean,
but there is, unfortunately, there is a tremendous motivation on the part of a really religious person to tend toward violence, because a really religious person believes they are doing God's will, and God's will is the only thing that really matters for our well-being. And so if you allow people to follow their own, as atheists do, their own misguided ideas of how they are supposed to live, they're harming themselves as well as other people. And violence always has to be guarded against because of that. When you put this together with a lack of knowledge of the outside world, a lack of education generally, violence is not a surprising outcome.
It is not.
Particularly, I would say, here in the Middle East. We were talking about the origins of Islam, and that's what this program is specifically about. For many hundreds of years during what we could call the Middle Ages in Europe, Islam was the center of education and culture in the world. Universities far better than anything that was found in Europe. And then it's as if they turned around in the 19th century and they had become colonies of Europe. Napoleon had come in and conquered them, and now England comes in and is only interested in their oil and running them for English purposes. And people said, not surprisingly, we are being used and we have not been faithful enough to our task that's been given to us, and violence was one of the outcomes.
It was the Islamic tradition that preserved Aristotle.
Yes, it was.
So we often forget without that tradition we might not have Aristotle's works.
Yeah, that's another whole fascinating story.
It is, isn't it?
And the way in which all that worked through Spain when Jews and Christians and Muslims were all living together. You know, one of the saddest things about all of this is that historically, relations between Muslims and Jews have been pretty good. Spain is the perfect example of that, in which Jews and Muslims lived together with considerable peace for several hundred years, until with Ferdinand and Isabel, Christians finally conquered the whole Iberian Peninsula and took over. And when that happened, the Jews living there now have the choice of A, you convert, B, you leave, or C, you die. Those are your only choices. Whereas when Muslims were running Spain, their choices were really pretty good. Things are not like that today, obviously. How much of that is religious? How much of that is political? Well, I think it's mostly political and economic.
Yeah, in other words, you're saying sometimes politics uses religion for its own purposes.
Do we have to move on to our mid-program break here?
Are we ready yet for the Okay, let's get, in case you're tuning in just now, this is a program by the Rationalists of East Tennessee and the Atheist Society of Knoxville, and it's a free thought forum funded by these two groups and by other individuals and sponsors. Shows are lively most Tuesdays afternoon 5 p.m. And you can tell your friends about it, and the streamline on ctvknox.org.
This is a call-in show, and we are live today, March 5th, 2013, and viewers can call in now to the number on the screen or tweet them to us at FFTVKnox.
And the Atheist Society of Knoxville, or ASK, meets twice a week. Evening meetups for fun, food and drink, conversation, and a venue for community, camaraderie, and outreach to atheists, agnostics, and freethinkers and other like-minded persons of East Tennessee area. So go meet up and have good conversation and good discussion with the people. And now let's ask Sam to run the ASK information video at this point. And there you can see it, and then we're going to
and are questioning
talk
your
about
religious beliefs, or simply believe in one less God than everyone else? Well, you're not alone. The Atheist Society of Knoxville is a fun and friendly group of people just like you that meets twice a week at a bar or restaurant. We meet every Tuesday night following the show at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria for happy hour. You'll find our group either inside or on the patio. Look for Richard Dawkins' silver-jacketed book, The God Delusion, standing upright on the table. On Fridays, we meet at Agave Azul or the Beard and Beer Market. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't. We all question what we believe at one point in our lives. If this is the time for you, come join us for food, drink, conversation, and fun.
So, the Rationalist of East Tennessee has Sunday activities involving lively presentation and discussion of subjects topical and timeless. Once a month, we get together for a book club. You need not have read the book to attend, but of course it helps. Visit rationalists.org to find us. And Sam, would you run the RET information video now?
Do you find stories of talking snakes laughable? Do you prefer the scientific method over supernatural beliefs? Are you concerned about religious leaders and organizations imposing their values and rules on your body, your family, and the rest of our society? Well, take comfort in the fact that you're not alone. The Rationalists of East Tennessee meets weekly for fellowship and provides a forum for people who support skeptical thinking and rational discussion of these and other issues. To find out more information or to find out about our next meeting, visit us on the web at www.rationalist.org.
I wanted to say something about the Rationalist of East Tennessee Book Club, the upcoming books, at least for March anyway. The book is The Epigenetics Revolution, How Modern Biology is Rewriting Our Understanding of Genetics, Disease, and Inheritance, written by Nessa Carey.
Okay, now let's get back to some of the questions I wanted to ask.
Yes, and anyone who wants to call in, please do so. We would like to hear from you.
We're pleased to.
Happy to try and answer your questions if we can.
Okay. You talked about how many Muslims there are.
Yeah, I said about 1.5 billion in the world.
Oh, I wanted to ask you a question. I didn't mention this to you earlier. There's been some conflict among some Muslims and Hindus. What's the fate, the eternal fate of Hindus from the Islamic tradition?
Well, I can tell you what happened historically there.
Yeah.
And what happened historically is after the first great sweep of Muslim conquest across North Africa and up into France and in East Europe, there was a retrenching, and then the second great sweep was across southern Asia, which is how they ended up in Indonesia, finally. The high point of that, in a sense, was the Mughal Empire in India, of which we know something about it if you have ever seen the Taj Mahal, which is not an Indian structure, but it's a Muslim structure. What happened in India, which is another story that's fascinating in its own right, is that in all the conquest that took place, the people of India tend to keep their own religion. And so the religion of the ruling caste became Islamic, but the religion of the great mass of Indian people remained Hindu.
How do they get,
and by and large,
wait a minute.
Muslims were happy with that.
How do they get to be the ruling class?
In this case, by conquest.
By force, you said.
When the Mughal Empire came in, they politically conquered it. India has been subject to one political conquering after another, none of which ever seemed to do much to the culture of India, which stayed the way it was. And so this is one example of it. What happened, of course, is down through the centuries now, you have animosities, and the animosities were between the Hindus and the Muslims. The British, when they were ruling India, were able to keep a lid on this. When the British left in 1947, the question was, given these centuries of conflict between the ruling Mughals, the Muslims, and the Hindus who actually lived there, is this going to burst out again? And the solution was to split India into two parts, into India and Pakistan.
So there was, in that sense, a political and
It was a political division, Pakistan, including what became Bangladesh. And so that was supposed to be the solution, but the solution, of course, doesn't solve where all the bordering areas like Kashmir go. And so you have a history of conflict that has come out of that. And once again, when you have uneducated people who are both claiming that they're the ones in charge, violence tends to be the result.
Granted, there are great differences of opinions among Muslims, among Christians on some issues. Now, if there is Orthodox Islam, now that's a big problem.
Yeah.
What would be the eternal state of Hindus who don't convert? Millions of them.
I don't. The Quran doesn't say anything about this. The Quran is primarily interested in the other people of the book, the Tanakh and the New Testament. And so, but the other thing that I mentioned earlier is the Quran does say that God has sent, I have sent, says God, prophets to all the nations. Well, the Indians have their prophets, and therefore, if they follow their path, at least one tradition in Islam will say that's perfectly okay.
At least
another tradition must have been saying, no, that's not okay, or they wouldn't have invaded India to form the Mughal Empire. But another tradition must have been saying, yes, it is okay, or they would have forced all the Hindus to become Muslims, which they didn't. So if you can figure out what is the traditional position out of all that, you're a better man than I.
Tell us the meaning of the word Islam itself.
Yes, it means submission. The best thing that I have read is, it is that peace which comes when one has submitted one's life entirely to God. And we now have an example, and this is the place in which people of all religion, including Jews, Christians, and Muslims, you can see them happily getting together. We have all submitted our lives to God, agreed we have some different ideas as to what that adds up to in terms of the details, but we all feel this kind of peace, so therefore we must all be doing something right.
Now, is it possible for it's possible for some Christians and some Jews to say atheists who don't think there is a supernatural being somehow are a part of, they're not demonized. Now some Christians, some Christians do demonize
That's very nice of you, Joe, to say they're not demonized.
But do some Muslims demonize atheists, is what I'm getting at.
I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do. But the big enemy from the very beginning is polytheists rather than atheists.
And there are not very many of those left.
And there are not very many of those left. And unfortunately in many ways, is
well, you could argue that Judaism and Christianity incorporated some of it. Take, for example, in Judaism, you have, now this came with Philo, a character, it's called wisdom, but it's Sophia, and it's a co-creator with God, and that sounds to me awfully close to polytheism. And of course, Christianity sounded like polytheism to many of the Muslims.
The history of Christianity and Islam, the history of it has been somewhat different. Christianity typically, particularly when it moved north in Europe out of Rome after Rome became the Holy Roman Empire, they tended to co-opt an awful lot
Co-op is the right word,
of pagan traditions, the Christmas tree and so on. The Muslim move tended to be that these people had to recognize the political authority of the new Muslim leaders. They had to pay their taxes, but if they did those two things, Jews in particular, it was perfectly okay if they practiced their own religions as long as they were good citizens. That tended to be in Persia, for instance, that tended to be the Muslim solution to what do you do with people of other religious beliefs when they become part of your political world.
Now, you had among Christianity a view the Jews could practice their religion so long as they did not try to argue with Christians about their religion. In other words, whereas the Christians could proselytize, the Jews could not.
Well, Jews were never very interested in proselytizing anyway. Well, that's another story.
Well, one reason, when you get your throat cut, you don't like proselytizing.
Even when they were more powerful, they just were never really in the proselytizing business.
Well,
one of the things my students often ask me early on in the religion course is, well, the problem with all religions is that they all think they're the only ones that are right, and they go around trying to make everyone else believe what they want to believe. But the story, as a matter of fact, is it's been mostly Christians and Muslims that have done this.
When you read the early Hebrew Bible, you see a lot of force and violence.
Right, but that force and violence is more often used for political reasons to get the promised land as their own land, rather than trying to convert other people to their beliefs. Okay. I mean, even when the Jews were in the Babylonian captivity, we just did.
Well, that's after once you're captives, you don't tend to proselytize. That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
It's against the law.
Well, okay. But
that's what...
Oh, I think we have another caller here.
Oh, good. Go.
Yes, and I would like to know, how did you find us? Do you live around here? And have you ever called before?
No, I never called before, but I watched lots of the programs. I wanted to ask about Zoroastrianism and the relationship between Islam and Zoroastrianism. That didn't Islam basically eliminate Zoroastrianism even though it was monotheistic?
Well, it's not quite monotheistic. There are two gods rather than one. I don't know whether Islam...
It's not gods, though, right?
Pardon?
It's not gods, is it? I mean, there's supposed to be one God. But at any rate, there's more than one spirit.
Yeah. The best answer I can give to your question is, I don't know whether they eliminated it or it just died out. I think that's one of the most fascinating stories in the history of religion, that Zoroastrianism, the belief in two ultimately powerful forces, is a perfectly sensible religious position, and yet, except for a few people in northwest India, it has just ceased to exist.
Much of it got absorbed with the concept of the devil.
That's part of what happened,
yeah.
Yes.
And also, you could say, one way to look at Zoroastrian religion is it's a monotheism with a God with two prongs, as it were, two natures. You've got the grace aspect, and in other words, if you got monotheism, one of the problems you got to deal with was tornadoes and disease and destruction and suffering, and that's got to be explained, especially if you got a powerful God. When Islam, the Zoroastrians tended to say, well, God had two avenues. Now, some interpretations of Zoroastrianism, you got two gods, but with Augustine, who had been a Zoroastrian, he simply absorbed part of the Zoroastrian tradition and put a lot of that into his concept of the devil, which Christianity had developed rather thoroughly, especially by the time you get to the Gospels and the book of Revelation. And talk about the devil in the Islamic tradition.
I want to reply to our caller. As far as Islam destroying Zoroastrianism, Zoroastrianism was centered in Persia, which, as you know, is now Iran. And when that became a Muslim country in a political sense, does that mean that Islam wiped it out, or it just ceased to have ground on which to thrive? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I understand that in the 1800s, there were still a lot of Zoroastrians in Iran, but I thought they were sort of driven out and they had to go to India. So, but that was sort of like the final test. And you know, when you talked about how Islam was the center of the great universities, such as the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, I wondered whether that wasn't, to some extent, due to the Zoroastrian influence, and that as they have gradually rejected the intellectual tradition and actually allowed the Europeans to surpass them, I thought maybe that coincided with the downfall of Zoroastrianism. I thought perhaps I could ask that.
Yeah, and it sounds like you know a lot of stuff here that I don't. If Zoroastrianism was one of the sources of the intellectual tradition in the Middle East, that's an interesting thought, and I don't know much about it, but it certainly makes sense that in any culture, they always draw from older ones. That happened to Judaism, it happened to Islam, and so I wouldn't be surprised if it happened here.
Yeah, you can.
I am surprised that Zoroastrianism was at all functioning in the 18th century. You have different sources than I do there, and I don't know.
No, it wasn't a big flat thing, but it was still around. But now I think, you know, the only Zoroastrians are in India, and I thought that was active, that there was actually something that changed politically, and that they stopped tolerating them at all. But, you know, since you said that mainly that was the polytheistic, I thought that it basically was everybody who wasn't Jews and Christians, and it didn't matter whether they were polytheistic. That was the main reason I called. And one other question is there any way that the prohibition against apostasy, that is that if you leave Islam, then you can be condemned to death, is there any way around that, any way they can moderate that?
That's not held by all Muslims, but it is certainly held in those countries in the Middle East where Islam is the powerful political force. We have another whole issue here on the relation between church and state, which is utterly different in the Islamic tradition than it is in the Western European Christendom tradition. I wish there was a way around it. And when I talked about the tradition in Islam in which other peoples could follow their own practices as long as they were good citizens and paid taxes and so on, I think that really was true for many hundreds of years, but it has become less true consistently in the last 100 years or so. And I think that's a great shame, but that's the way it goes.
You lose it means that a lot of Islamic scholars don't have the freedom that they would want.
Yes.
Because if you don't have freedom, separation of church and state, for example, if you don't have that, you lose a lot of freedom of academic inquiry.
Yeah, there was a professor, right, who was accused of apostasy for saying that before he had the Quran revealed to him that Muhammad could not have been a Muslim, and this was treated as apostasy.
Yes.
You have a similar thing in the Soviet Union when the atheists took over.
But you had to be a good Marxist-Leninist.
You had to have Orthodox Atheism run by a bunch of criminals. I mean, all religions, when they dominate with power, are doing it by criminal activity. When you force people...
You put things much more strongly than I would, Joe.
Yeah, I'm looking at it from a minority's point of view. You force someone to do something and believe something and confess something, that's criminal behavior. Now, you can give it a nicer term if you want, but that's the way I see it.
Yeah. But one comment on this that might be helpful here is when the fatwa was put against Salman Rushdie for doing the kind of thing that you mentioned by a professor. I mean, Rushdie did that sort of thing. One thing that has been a traditional Islamic position is that the only thing that a Muslim is bound to obey is the Quran, and fatwas are not given by the Quran. They are given by a particular political spokesman.
Political is a good point.
Which means you can be just as dead when it turns out, but from the Muslim theological position, those who are doing the killing are not being good Muslims when they're doing that, because the only thing you're required to follow is the Quran.
Could you make a case by uniting religion and the state, you do a disservice to both?
Oh, that's Roger Williams' position, the good founder of Baptist denomination. Every time you combine state and religion, you corrupt both of them, so best to keep them apart.
Okay.
Be nice if more Baptists in East Tennessee remembered what their founder had
what
to
their
say
founder,
about that.
Jerry Falwell apparently never learned it in the first place. For some reason, I don't know.
So I don't feel like, caller, I don't feel like I have been terribly helpful to you. I think you've been more helpful to me, but we appreciate your call.
Yeah, I guess a lot of this is not they record it. It's like the bad side of your religion. You don't want to remember it even. Yeah, all right, thanks for taking the call. I'll let you get back to it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
One of the good things about the Zoroastrian tradition is they were trying to deal with the problem of human suffering and what they call evil in the world. That is harm that other people do and the destruction that nature brought about. And if a God is all-powerful, then somehow that has to be taken into consideration. And the Zoroastrian tradition tried to say, well, and as I understand, the original version is tried to say, well, God has, in a sense, a kind of a non-rational dimension of his being, and he simply can't do perfect activities. And so but he's still powerful. And there's a current, well, he died in 1953, but a philosopher, Brightman, a personalist, says God has a non-rational and a rational part of his nature. And so tornadoes and destruction, that's part of God's dynamic energy that he can't completely coordinate. This
is the great problem. The problem of evil is the great problem for religion. And no religions that I know have ever really solved it. But on the other hand, if we didn't see evils, I don't think we would ever come up with religion in the first place. I mean, if everything was really hunky-dory from the very beginning, then we would think, gee, I don't need a God. You know, I'm doing fine without one.
But I think
evil, which is the source of the religious quest.
I think religion began. Now, of course, you can get about 100 definitions of religion.
That's right.
But I think religion began when simply you had an enormous animism and anthropomorphism. This is long before science. You had a kind of technology, but you tried to explain the world. But you did it in terms of personification of forces.
That's right.
And religion, it seems to me, to be the outgrowth of this, or it's the embodiment of this. And then once you say one of them is supremely powerful, you solve the problem of power, but you have a moral problem.
That's right.
Why is there so much immorality and destruction? And then if you have the crazy notion that God destroyed most of the human race in a flood, you'd say, that's poor designing. Speaking of intelligent design, that doesn't seem too intelligent. And so you see at that point, theism has to rework itself. And that's what made Brightman say God had a non-rational aspect.
Yes, and to follow up on that point just for a second, Joe, all religions are always in the process of redesigning themselves.
That's a good point.
If they don't redesign themselves, they simply go out of business. They don't get disproven. They just stop being appealing to people unless they remain current with what things are. I've always thought one of the great strengths of Christianity is that it just keeps making new forms of itself endlessly as the world that it is in changes, coming from the old world to the new world and from one culture to another. One of the problems of Islam is the struggle because so much emphasis is put on the Quran, which is supposed to be so literally true, that it has a harder time adjusting itself Particularly, I think, and I'm speaking like very much a 20th century liberal kind of person, particularly in terms of what's due about women. It's tough for women to accept a world in which they are supposed to be obedient, in a world in which they are now educated and economically powerful.
The two women I referred to earlier, the Muslim women, one of them spoke in this town in a Christian, in a church, and she sounded like Thomas Jefferson on church-state separation, religious liberty.
Yes.
And it was a highly articulate, intelligent presentation that any university professor would have been happy to give. And this was a Muslim woman. And then I mentioned this other Muslim woman in Texas that I could learn. I mean, I said, this is a woman I need to, I said, don't charge me tuition, I can't afford you right now, but let me learn from it. And what was interesting is her family called me from Pakistan to help me solve a family problem. What I'm saying is, we had human connection. She's a Muslim humanist, and I'm a humanist. And I said, don't you think there might be humanists of other religions? And she's a smart woman. I just learned a lot from this gal, an awful lot. And I wish Islam, Orthodox or whatever you want to call Middle East Islam, could learn more from their own women. That's a big loss, it seems to me.
We're almost running out of time here, but a quick comment on that is that the world that Muhammad lived in was a world in which women were really in a miserable position. Not that they haven't been in a miserable position in lots of cultures, but that world in Saudi Arabia was one in which they were literally just pieces of property with no rights whatsoever. And what Muhammad managed to do was to enormously expand the rights of women in that 7th century world. The problem was the way in which he expanded the rights of women was by linking it specifically to what the Quran says. And now Islam is, I don't mean to be critical here, Islam is stuck with that. It's very hard for them to move beyond this enormous freeing of women that was accomplished in the 7th century.
If they had church-state separation more, but you know, their position on this, again, lots of topics that have come up as we're almost running out of time. Their position on this really is a sensible one. God is not just concerned, says a Muslim, I think says any theist, with how we live our private lives. God wants us to live our public lives well as well. And so he tells us how we're supposed to organize. That's Sharia. How we're supposed to organize our public lives. And so the only way you can do this effectively is by having this expressed in the government and the laws of the land. Now that's
Thank goodness, I think, that we in the United States have largely managed to stay out of this. Though I do remember one candidate for governor when Haslam was elected saying if he was elected, he would make the laws of the Bible the laws of Tennessee. And I kind of shook my head at that. Boy, that is a dangerous path to go down.
You know he had not read the Bible. When he said that, you know he hadn't read it. He just talked it.
Did wonder about how some of those things were going to be accomplished. But
and how he would survive execution himself on bearing false witness.
I knew that this hour would go quickly, and even without very many calls, all the kinds of detours we would get off on. And there's so much to talk about here still that I urge people. There's lots of good books on Islam that are out there. Lots of good textbooks that have very balanced kinds of views on the history of Islam. You can get them at any decent library, including the Knox County Library. And so I urge our listeners to do just that, to use this as an opportunity to learn more about it.
I like that. As a humanist, I'd like to see the human side in all of these religions come out better. And so that we can all see how they try to solve their problems. Maybe we could learn something, just as they could learn from us, you see.
Yes. Well, we're down to our last 30 seconds here.
So we've got to come get on the ball here, don't we? It's time to start wrapping up things. So get out your pen and paper. This has been Freethought Forum, the program for Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. And
please send us feedback. Leave voicemail at 865-272-9060. That's 272